A while back, I posted a short called The Most Ridiculous Opener in Final Fantasy XIV. In the comments of that short, I asked about the most ridiculous openers you guys knew of. I have picked out 5 openers, 3 of which still exist today and 2 from the past, although one of them might be a little too close to the present for comfort. Keep in mind that in most cases, ridiculous openers are either fight specific or are normally accompanied by a more reasonable opener. For example, the 18-second Paladin opener does come equipped with a 4-second opener alternative, and the 18-second opener is exclusive to the now less popular Fast Paladin, meaning that you can entirely avoid it. Now, let's start with the least ridiculous one, mostly because it is the actual optimal opener of Blue Mage, suggested by Mila Mikote and Gustavo Xen. Use Whistle up to 27 seconds before pull, then precast Tinkle, Moonflute and weave J-Kick. Triple Trident weaving Nightbloom, Rose of Destruction weaving Feather Rain, Bristle weaving Swiftcast, Glass Dance and 4 Serpanakas. Yes, that is a sextuple weave. Then use Matra Magic weaving Shock Strike and then Phantom Flurry. Just letting the ticks pass as it will deal more damage than finishing early. Almost immediately after that, Moonflute ends, typically right as you start Phantom Flurry, disabling all actions for 15 seconds. Imagine if your 15-second long openers actually had a hard cutoff point where the following 15 seconds you weren't allowed to do anything. Now, that sounds like a terrible time. Keep in mind that this opener is for the level 70 Blue Mages out there, so when one day Blue Mages go to level 80, I wonder which of these actions will disappear from the list to make space for even more ridiculous spells. Next up is another opener that exists in Endwalker. Ever heard of Cursed Warrior Openers? If you thought the Paladin's 18-second opener was silly, wait till you see the 29-second Warrior Opener. Suggested by Jerails, Roranic, Ru Uchiha, Hestroa and Hazardous Sheep, and additionally, tabs added some further insight. 29 seconds before combat starts, use Inner Release. Yes, and then just stand there. You heard me. Open with Primal Rend and weave Infuriate, then 1, 2, 3 into Storm's Eye, Inner Chaos and weave Upheaval and Onslaught. Heavy Swing weaving Infuriate again, and then Inner Chaos weaving 2 Onslaughts. 2, 3 Storm's Path into Fellcleave. The reasons to use this opener are twofold. Jerails noted that the purpose of the opener is to sneak in 1 extra Primal Rend over the course of a fight, which means the use of such an opener is extremely specific. Roranic further adds that it was specifically used in P3S. And finally, tabs added that the real purpose behind this opener is passing. As tanks have no raid damage cooldowns, they are more typically measured on personal DPS rather than raid DPS, and so using Primal Rend an extra time, despite displacing Inner Release from all the raid burst windows, is completely irrelevant for your passing, even if it might result in you actually doing less damage doing it this way. I sure wonder why some people think passing might be unhealthy for the game. Just to stay on the same subject in terms of jobs, another warrior opener was suggested by Burke, and this one is from Heavensward. Now, a lot of players didn't play back in Heavensward, and many of the mechanics of jobs were completely different back then, so it might be difficult to follow the rotation without the background knowledge. But do not fret, I have you covered. I dived back in time to figure out how all these effects worked back in the day, so a little history lesson may be in order. Thank you to Mr. Happy for making an A Realm Reborn warrior guide detailed enough to include all the necessary information to understand this years ago. This is why I made my History of the Summoner video just before Endwalker for the Final Fantasy XIV archaeologists. Alright, so instead of a beast gauge, the warrior had a stack of a buff. This buff was either called Wrath or Abandon, depending on whether you were in the tank stance or the DPS stance. Now, these stances are a bit of a side bit to this story, and since this is the big damage opener, let's assume we are using the DPS stance and leave that part out of the story. This means that we have abandon stacks. Each stack would increase your critical hit rate, and when you reach 5 stacks, Fellcleave would be enabled. Using Fellcleave would set you back to 0 stacks. Most actions you know that give Beast Gauge each gave 1 abandon stack, meaning that performing our 1-2-3 combo would result in gaining 2 stacks. Additionally, you could at most hold 5 stacks, meaning you had to use Fell Cleave really soon when enabled. In addition to the 2-3 combos giving stacks, certain other abilities also quite randomly gave stacks. One of them was Raw Intuition, which was a parry all attacks from the front, all attacks from anywhere else are critical hits buff. Very unique, but intended to be similar to the Paladin's Sheltron in some ways. Another was Vengeance, which only caused you to retaliate when you got hit, without the damage reduction portion. Finally, Infuriate of course gave you 5 stacks outright. Berserk technically also gave a stack, but due to what we are trying to accomplish, this is irrelevant to the opener. Back then, Berserk, instead of giving you guaranteed critical hits, gave you an astronomically large 50% attack power increase. This was equivalent to gaining 50% strength, which in terms of number calculations is a bit more complicated than having a straight 50% more damage done kind of buff. So whether this was literally 50% more damage output is hard to say, but it was a lot, that is for certain. This buff lasted 20 seconds and would immediately after pacify you, disabling weapon skills for 5 seconds. This pacification could be removed by healers or bards using Warden's Paean, which made it all the more infuriating for the warrior if a bard was present and they simply couldn't be bothered to. Now, with the history lesson out of the way, let's talk about the opener Berg presented us. 45 seconds before pull, use Infuriate, giving you 5 abandon stacks with a 30-second duration. Infuriate could be used out of combat back then. I sure do wonder why they disabled that. Then, 15 seconds before combat, the millisecond before the abandon stacks run out, use Raw Intuition or Vengeance to refresh the 5 stacks to still have 30 seconds of duration. Then, Berg explained this allowed you to fit 3 Fell Cleaves inside Berserk and raid buffs. Now, I had to fill in some blanks to figure out exactly how this would work, so if this recounting of the opener is inaccurate, I would love to hear the correction in the comments. On pull, use Tomahawk, and then Heavy Swing and Late Weave Berserk. Then use Fell Cleave and weave the other of Vengeance or Raw Intuition you didn't use to get back to 1 stack. Then use Main, which back then increased slashing damage on the target, followed by Storm's Eye, which also gave you a damage boost as always. Then another Heavy Swing, followed by a step 2 and 3 combo of your choosing, given back then that you had an alternative 2-3 that increased enmity in addition to the combos we have today. For the sake of a demonstration, let's assume we use Storm's Path. After the 3rd step, you have 5 abandon stacks and can use Fell Cleave again, followed by Infuriate, which had ready due to the initial 45-second wait, and then use Fell Cleave one last time. Depending on your skill speed and your performance on Late Weaving Berserk, you would have either 8 or 9 GCDs to perform this, and this would in fact take 8 GCDs to do. And if you mess up, you would have up to 5 seconds of inability to finish your combo, leaving you to stew on the mistakes that led you to this fate. Next up, a summoner opener that could feasibly work from Stormblood to Shadowbringers and technically might have worked in 6.0 of Endwalker. The 10 Creative-Blinis presented to me what I have decided to name the Devotion Dance. Before we get to the opener itself, another history lesson. In Stormblood, summoners learned an ability called Ether Pact, not the same as the Scholar one, although it was probably intentional that they have the same names. Ether Pact commanded your pet, whichever one it was, to cast Devotion, which did the same thing regardless of your pet. In 4.0, this was a 90-second cooldown that gave 5% more damage, healing, and also reduced damage taken by 5% for players near the pet for 15 seconds. How close this meant exactly appears to have been lost to time. However, in 4.1, the values were all changed to 3%, the cooldown increased to 120 seconds, and the area of effect was changed to 30 yalms. You know, effectively the entire arena of most any boss fight. Shockingly, a 5% performance across the board on a 90-second cooldown turned out to be a bit strong. Then in Shadowbringers, this was changed to a 180-second cooldown and the damage bonus was increased back to 5%, while the healing and damage reduction components were entirely removed. Now, devotion itself is not really the problem with this opener. The problem lies with how pets work in Final Fantasy XIV. You see, before Endwalker, pets had multiple actions. Before Shadowbringers, you could command most of these actions separately from your character without weaving a thing. And in Shadowbringers, you had 2 Eggy Assault actions that had 2 charges each, allowing you to essentially queue up 4 actions in quick succession if you so desired. If you want to know more about these Eggy Assault actions, watch my Shadowbringers starter guide for summoners. Now, the key thing about this is that if you commanded your pet to use Eggy Assault 1, whatever it was, and then Eggy Assault 2, whatever that was, the pet would always use Eggy Assault 1, and then 2, assuming it could target something with the actions within a reasonable time frame. This means that if you commanded Eggy Assault 1, Eggy Assault 2, and then Aether Pact, then it would in fact mean Devotion would come out as the 3rd thing in the pet's queue. And here is where the problem arises. You could, and still can, command your pet to move to a specific location. The move command takes priority over pretty much all other actions your pet can perform, and at least before Endwalker, your pet had to stand still to perform any action, a bit like enemy mobs usually do. The fact that moving took precedence over actions meant that you could actually force your pet to delay the action you had just ordered it to perform. For attacking, this wasn't that helpful, since your pet only did a somewhat small amount of the total damage over the course of a fight. You didn't need to queue up a bunch of attacks for some shenanigans. Enter the Devotion Dance. When Aether Pact is used, it immediately goes on cooldown, but Devotion is actually cast only when your pet finds time to perform it. Before the boss fight begins, meaning 75 seconds before pull in 4.0, 105 seconds in 4.1 and beyond, and 165 seconds in Shadowbringers, use Aether Pact and then order your pet to run in circles around the boss arena until pull time. A single slip up and the pet will cast Devotion early, and you cannot queue up multiple move commands in succession. You have to send a new move every second or so. Then, on pull, you let your pet stop the Devotion Dance, Devotion is cast, the raid receives its damage buff, and fighting begins. Then, 15 seconds into the fight, you could use Devotion again. Well, assuming you weren't busy with Bahamut at that very moment. Now, in Endwalker, Aether Pact and Devotion were replaced by Searing Light. And in 6.0, Searing Light commanded your Carbuncle to cast Searing Light. This was later changed to be an ability cast by the summoner itself in 6.1 due to issues concerning queuing up Searing Light but losing it due to ghosting. When you command your pet to do something, if the pet for some reason fails to do it, you do not get the cooldown refunded. However, in 6.0, it might have been feasibly possible to perform the Devotion Dance with Searing Light to get a full minute of Searing Light at the start of the fight, although it would display Searing Light from all your other raid cooldowns, which may not have been worth it after all. It is also possible the more responsive nature of pets in Endwalker prevented this behavior entirely. This sort of opener is an excellent example to demonstrate that the players will always find a way to break the game to push out more damage. And finally, mentioned by Jed Erickson, Joshua Maya, and Hazardous Sheep, a combination of Black Mage in general, as well as the legendarily hilarious Infinite Paradox. Now, I will give an honorable mention to Black Mage openers in general, as they get impressively intricate. I will not go into great detail about this example opener presented by The Balance for P2S specifically, but notice how the opener clarifies specific casts that are guaranteed procs and that it is over 2 minutes long given that ley lines appears twice. Just as a clear sign of the length of the opener, it is 78 spells long. Now, the Infinite Paradox is in fact a ridiculous opener that a lot of players may have heard of. The known fact about it is that it is about 3% weaker than a proper opener. However, the benefit of the Infinite Paradox opener and rotation is that aside from the very first spell in the opener, it uses exclusively instant spells, so you never have to stand still. For additional comedy, the classic version of the opener does not use ley lines because that would confine you to a small area to move in. To help you follow the rotation, I will put a blue corner on actions cast in Umbral Ice and a red corner on actions cast in Astral Fire. I will not be tracking Umbral Heart stacks, as it turns out all the spells in the rotation conveniently avoid spending these entirely. I will however track the amount of Umbral Ice or Astral Fire stacks, as you see, when switching stance you are only granted access to Paradox if you had 3 when you switched. I will also add a pink corner to actions that are instant because of Swift or Triple Cast, and include a number counting the amount of casts it used. I will also use a green corner for actions that are instant because of a proc Firestarter, and a yellow corner for actions that are just instant by default. Now, why is it called the Infinite Paradox? Naturally, because of the amount of Paradox casts performed. The key feature here is that Paradox cast in Umbral Ice is instant and free, while Paradox cast in Astral Fire has a cast time and a cost, but can proc Firestarter. You get access to Paradox when you switch into the other state while at 3 stacks of your current state. When switching to Fire, you also need to have 3 Umbral Hearts. This is the reason why the opener includes Blizzard 4 to get to 3 stacks. Paradox does unaffected damage, so it is unaffected by Astral Fire's damage boosting properties, and so the Ice Paradox being instant, costing nothing and just generally being easier to work with makes it the preferred version to cast. Hence, we will try to exclusively use Fire Paradox with Sharp Cast up to make sure every Fire Paradox we cast gives us a Fire 3 to use for an extra instant cast. And since we use Fire 3 to switch to Astral Fire, immediately followed by Transpose, it means we get 2 instant spells to cast. This is also the reason why Thunder is completely absent, because while it can give us more instant casts, it is unreliable. Finally, as mentioned, we use Transpose a lot. Like a lot. As long as we have 3 Umbral Hearts, using Transpose will always give us access to Paradox. But to use Ice Paradox, we need to enter Astral Fire, and because Transpose has a 5-second cooldown, we sometimes need to enter Fire and just hang out in it without casting any fire spells for 5 seconds. Because every time we do, we also would have to use Umbral Soul, which is undesirable. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this weird path through the present and down memory lane interesting, funny, or fascinating, please consider leaving a like. You can also subscribe or open on the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you have a memory of some absurd opener or something you would like to add or correct to any of these openers, please do leave a comment about it. Fun fact, back in Stormblood and Heavensward, the warrior's single target spenders were Inner Beast while in the tank stance and Fell Cleave in the DPS stance. Inner Beast healed you, reduced damage taken by 20% for 6 seconds and also did decent damage. However, Fell Cleave did more damage, so people rarely, if ever, would use Inner Beast if they could get away with it.